Rob Collins Show with Anna DeBlantis right here on 720 WGN. All right, a lot going on today. Coming up a little bit later on in the program, a young man who hasn't accomplished much in his acting career, Ryan Gosling, is going to be with us. He's he's been in something. What was he?
He was in the La La Land, among other films, and his director in that movie, Damien Chazelle, who was the youngest director to ever win an Oscar at the age of 32, and now has directed him in the story of Neil Armstrong, First Man.
And they are going to be in the studio.
First two men.
There's two men in the studio with us. Coming up, you'll hear that at 5:30 today. All right, now let's talk about let's go back to Jason Van Dyke's story from last week. And Dan Herbert is joining us in the studio. He's Jason Van Dyke's attorney. And let's first of all, I'd like to get a sense of what your reaction was, because the cameras were trained on you and Jason Van Dyke as the jury was being read. And it seems at one moment you right after it was a second-degree murder, guilty of second-degree murder, you touched Jason Van Dyke's knee. You went over and you kind of tapped his knee like, I'm here with you. Describe that moment to us.
Well, it's the opposite of what most people think. Once I heard second-degree murder, I actually felt a sense of relief. So I had told him beforehand, I said, if we hear second-degree murder, that's not the death sentence. We know that first-degree murder is off the table. So it really was a bit of a sense of relief, because they came back pretty quick, and that always scares me, in a case like this.
That's sort of conventional wisdom, right? That if they come back quickly, they're gonna find on the side of the government.
Yeah. So I said if they come back Thursday, we're in trouble. So they sent out a question late in the morning on Friday, and that's when I realized this thing is coming to a verdict today.
Okay. What was that question? Can you say?
Yeah, it was about the 16 shots, whether the number, the way they charged it was based on the autopsy, and they wanted to know if they had to look at them individually or as a whole. So
I think one of the things that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to people who are not in the legal world, but the charges of aggravated battery, the 16 counts of aggravated battery, actually each count, the single count of that, is a stiffer penalty than second-degree murder, potentially. Right? It's because the parameter is different.
Yeah, true. And in the 16 counts, a lot of people made a big deal about that. For sentencing purposes, there's no difference between a conviction on one count or 16.
But it's still 6-year minimum, 30-year maximum, and on the second-degree murder, it's a 4-year minimum, 20-year maximum. And there's a possibility that, in Cook County, especially in cases like this, when it's a single act, generally there's concurrency as opposed to consecutive sentences. But
so in other words, they're not going to be stacked up. There's just, whether it was 1 or 16.
Correct. Yeah, in second degree, it's probationable as well.
Right. But let's... just as a point of fact, I was thinking about this at the moment that this all came down. The 16 counts of aggravated battery are based, obviously, on the 16 shots. But if it is determined that in this particular case, the victim died, can you still batter a corpse? And is there a sentence appeal potentially on that, or could the judge pull that all back and away and say, well, those counts don't count, I'm not going to sentence on those?
But it's a good question, and I think that argument is kind of irrelevant now, based upon the fact that they convicted on the first count of aggravated battery as well as the remaining ones. But that certainly was a strategy that we used at trial, because we felt very good that we would be able to justify the first volley of shots, and we had evidence that the first volley of shots were in fact the deadly shots. So yeah, that was going to be our argument, that the subsequent shots essentially were irrelevant, and there wasn't a lot of precedent on it. I kind of got the idea from, there was a Toronto streetcar case. I think it was Forcillo was the name of the defendant, but it was a police officer that shot 2 volleys of shots, ironically very similar to this case, and I think the jury found that the first volley was justified and the second volley wasn't.
Let's talk about how Jason Van Dyke is doing today. And he's in county jail now, right, awaiting sentencing. And sentencing will be October 31st. Is that correct? Still scheduled for that?
Yeah, we're up. I don't believe we're going to do the sentencing on that day. My guess is we'll do it a month later. We haven't checked with the court on that, but I'm planning on filing some motions to dismiss the verdict based upon lack of evidence. So that will likely take place before we do sentencing. So I would assume that we'll do sentencing sometime in November.
And we expect he'll be in county jail until then?
There was some talk about moving him. They were fearful that county would not be a safe place, but he is still in county as we sit here today.
Dan, have you had a chance to go back and listen or study what some of the jurors who spoke with the media said about why they voted to convict it, and kind of analyze that and think about how the trial went out? Have you had a chance to hear some of what they had to say?
Yeah, a lot of people have sent me some clips, and it's interesting and surprising and not surprising in some manners. We attempted to get some jury instructions that would accurately define the law for the jurors, and we were denied the ability to do that on a couple of points, and it was I found it was ironic that many of the jurors, when they thought Jason Van Dyke should have used less lethal alternatives. We had a jury instruction on that we proposed. It's an accurate statement of law saying that police officers do not have to use lesser alternatives before they use deadly force. I think that jury instruction would have been really important. We also had one from the United States.
Wait, was that jury instruction? That jury instruction was not in your statement.
It was not given, no.
Okay.
Which is, we have two really, really good bases for appeal.
An appeal would be an reversible error here, right? That I don't know if that's in the state court. I know in the federal court that's what they call it. But if you have a situation where that instruction is not given, an appeals court could take a look at that and say, okay, well then declare a mistrial and then retry?
Well, they can throw out the conviction. They could send it back for a new trial. We certainly would be seeking that the conviction be thrown out.
Will you be handling the appeal?
Probably, yeah. It's up to my client, obviously. I
want to play something here, and I want to get your thought on this, because the closing argument, obviously, it's really important in a case like this, because 3 weeks of testimony in state court, that's a long time, right? There's a lot of data that they had to go through. There were a lot of witnesses that the jury had to consider, and so the closing argument, critical to kind of wrap up everything. And one of the jurors said this, because race in this city is always an overtone to things, as opposed to an undertone. And the question was asked of one of the jurors, did race ever come into this?
I don't feel that it did until the end. The statement that was made at the end was wrong to me. The Boy Scout statement. I just didn't feel that was appropriate.
Okay, so that's a reference. When you said in your close, you said that if this were a Boy Scout with a knife, it would be a different story. But Quan McDowell was not a Boy Scout. Do you want that one back?
No. I don't see how that's racial. I mean, this woman apparently assumed that it was, but as far as I know, there are black Boy Scouts, so it was never meant to be racial in any way. And the fact of the matter is, race was a huge part of this case, not for us, but for the prosecution. They made race an issue
right off the beginning, right in the opening statement.
Right off the beginning. So I don't know. I disagree with that juror. To suggest that we somehow introduced race into it is the opposite of what happened.
Dan, what about some of the jurors saying they felt that your client sounded rehearsed on the stand, that they didn't feel that he really was remorseful, that he was working off of talking points?
Well, obviously I prep every client before they take the stand. As far as Jason Van Dyke, I would say he was probably the least rehearsed client I've ever had. There were some points that I felt would have been strong for him to make. One of them just to show a little bit of humanity and recognize that the video looks bad, and explain that it looked really bad from his perspective when he had to use force. And, to be honest, Jason Van Dyke had a little trouble going there. And I think it's because he just has such a strong, vivid memory of this, and he firmly believes that his actions were correct. So, I wanted him to be natural, and so I certainly didn't push that issue with him. But at the end of the day, we knew Jason wasn't going to hit a home run, but we just needed him to make contact, and I firmly believe that he did. I mean, if the jurors thought that he was not credible, that's not based on any impeachment points from the prosecutors. That's just their personal opinions. So,
it's such a different thing when you watch these trials, and the trials in Cook County Court are different than what you see on television, right? Or you see in movies,
sure.
and what lawyers are looking for, and what jurors take away from these things are very different than when you're an audience watching something on television or in a theater, because it's all designed to hit you at one moment. And this is like an over time. You're building a case brick by brick, right through this. And I thought you had a pretty good tool, which was this video that you guys have produced that was an animation essentially from the perspective of as close as you could get to Jason Van Dyke's perspective on this, and to see how Laquan McDonald was closing the distance gap, and he had displayed his knife. He had actually opened his knife, displayed it, and all of that. And he was closing the district and looked at the distance and looked very, very different. And he and Joseph Walsh, their testimony, even though Joe Walsh was a prosecution witness, I thought it was very helpful to your side here in telling the story. Like, I would have shot him, except that Jason Van Dyke was in my way. I might have opened fire as well. I thought that video was really, really compelling evidence, and it seemed like the jury negated it.
I don't disagree with you. I thought it was compelling. I remember when I first saw it, I'm like, well, can it look more imminent? Can it look more dangerous, more imminent? And the person that did this is extremely talented at what he does, and he's like, no, I'm not going to do a video game. This is an accurate recreation. And, it didn't, like, the prosecutors made a big point about how it didn't show on the video Laquan McDonald swinging his right hand with the knife from behind his buttocks and then over his left shoulder. And his answer was pretty telling on that point. He said, well, that I didn't see in the video. It was impossible to see it from the video.
Because they were trying to impeach the video by saying that you were trying to make it more dramatic.
Yeah, and then they kind of switched and said that it wasn't dramatic enough. But the critical point for the video, in our view, was that this, for 4 years, the narrative has been Laquan McDonald was walking away. Laquan McDonald was walking away. This video showed beyond any doubt, it hasn't been impeached in any manner, that Laquan McDonald, in fact, was closing the distance on Jason Van Dyke. The video showed he went from, I believe it was 39 feet to 13 feet within a couple of seconds.
All right, and before we let you go, Dan Herbert, we're talking to, is the attorney for Jason Van Dyke. Have you spoken to the family? How are they doing?
I spoke to his wife a couple hours ago, and as a matter of fact, it was a nice talk. His daughters wrote him letters. Jason, I'm actually getting chills thinking about it, but they wrote some letters to him, and Tammy Went, who was part of my trial team, she actually went to the county jail and delivered these letters to Jason.
All right. It's quite a Chicago story this year. It has been for the last 4 years, but this is quite a moment. And you saw. Do you have any reaction to what you saw on the streets on Friday?
Well, it wasn't. I think the way that the verdict came out, and it seemed very one-sided. At the end of the day, it wasn't the outcome that we wanted, but there was a sense of relief from our standpoint. Jason Van Dyke came into this trial throughout the entire proceeding, not with the presumption of innocence, but with the presumption of guilt.
And that he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison.
Right. It was a death sentence. It was a minimum of 45 years. And, now he's looking at, I would hope, the minimum, like any other defendant gets when it's their first offense, which would be 6 years at 50%, which is 3 years. You know, that when you're looking at the backdrop of a death sentence versus 3 years, you can see your daughters graduate from college. You can see your daughters get married. You can hold your grandchildren. Based upon that backdrop, there really was a sense of relief.
All right. Dan, thank you very much for coming in. Appreciate it. Dan
Thank
Herbert,
you.
the attorney for Jason Van Dyke. Judy Pilak standing by. She's going to tell us what's coming up at the top there in the newsroom.
Laquan McDonald's family on forgiving.